Hey everybody, Seth here, and we're closing in on Halloween, one of the coolest holidays of all time. And I've been getting pretty pumped. I got this room looking pretty creepy. I put up these peel and stick bloodstains all around the room. Here are some right behind this picture of little Seth in his underwear and a robe. We've got some blood running down underneath the Blinky painting. Here's a pretty nasty one next to Clint. I wanted to stick the bloodstain right on his chest, but I didn't want to ruin my poster any more than it's already ruined by those horrible looking creases. There are a couple next to this guitar-playing skeleton dude. Yeah, keep on rocking, man. And you can never go wrong with the orange lights. Aw, yeah. I get so excited around Halloween. I can listen to heavy metal music all the time and not feel guilty. I can watch a horror movie whenever I want. And I can break out the classic scary video games. So in honor of Halloween, I'd like to talk about the music in one of my favorite video games of all time. Castlevania on the Nintendo Entertainment System. Castlevania was developed by Konami, a video game company that, throughout the 80s and 90s, was practically synonymous with incredible game music, as well as incredible games in general. You really can't say enough good things about Konami. They had a crack team of composers working for them, and alongside other companies like Capcom, Sunsoft, and Nintendo itself, helped define the musical aesthetic of the Nintendo Entertainment System. That classic NES sound. Konami titles like Contra, Super C, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and the 3 NES Castlevania games are beloved today just as much for their music as for their gameplay. And Konami took their music seriously. A handful of its composers were in a band, you heard me right, a musical band, called the Kukaiha Club. I'm probably pronouncing that wrong. They played live shows and they even put out a couple of albums in the early 90s. One of them has a creepy baby face on the cover. Now how could you not love that? Other video game companies had their own bands at the time too. Capcom had a band called Alf Lyla, Sega had the SST band, Taito had Zuntata, and Data East had Gamadelic. What? So let's move on to the music of Castlevania. The soundtrack was composed by 2 women composers. And I know that I shouldn't have to specify that they're women in our post-gender biased utopian world, but oh shit, never mind, yes I do, because I guess the struggle for women's rights is still an issue for some reason. If you're sick of the pervasive sexism that underlies, well, everything, then look no further than video game music. It's an equal opportunity employer. Alright, where was I? Castlevania's music team sported a pretty impressive lineup. One of the composers was Kinuyo Yamashita, an up-and-coming game composer at the time who hadn't yet worked on a video game score. Her biggest success at Konami was with the Castlevania score, but since leaving Konami in 1989, she has created some other notable game scores, for games such as Power Blade for the NES, Mega Man: The Wily Wars for the Sega Genesis, or Mega Drive depending on where you're from, and Mega Man X3 for the Super Nintendo. The other half of the composing team was Satoe Terashima, who not only composed music for Castlevania and Castlevania 2, but also did uncredited composition work for the Goonies too. Konami wasn't always the best at crediting its team members. In the credits of Castlevania, all of the Konami team members are given pseudonyms that are puns based on people who famously worked in horror cinema. Hitoshi Akamutsu gets a director credit under the name Trans Fisher, like Terrence Fisher, the director of many Hammer horror films, as well as a screenplay credit under the name Bram Stoker, like Bram Stoker, the dude that wrote Dracula. The music credit goes to James Banana. You know, like James Bernard, the guy who wrote music for a bunch of Hammer horror films in the 50s and 60s. Do you get it? Isn't it funny? Okay, it's not funny. Here are some more cool beans. The sound programmer was another yet undiscovered genius, a man by the name of Hidenori Maezawa. He went on to compose some pretty important NES soundtracks. I don't know, you may have heard of them. Little games like Contra, Super C, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and, The Adventures of Bayou Billy. Yeah, that one too. So Castlevania had some pretty serious talent at the helm when it came to the music, and they delivered the goods. The soundtrack to the game is undoubtedly one of the most memorable in the NES library. Tracks like Vampire Killer and Poison Mind have endured and found their way into subsequent Castlevania games. But what is it about the music of this game that makes it so special? Why are so many of us who have played the game able to instantly recall tunes from it, even if we haven't played it in months or years? Well, let's take a look, shall we? In Castlevania, the evil vampire Count Dracula is resurrected every 100 years and wreaks havoc across Transylvania. You take control of Simon Belmont, a vampire hunter who has to destroy Dracula. You're taking part in the family business, since all of your Belmont ancestors were vampire hunters as well. I guess you didn't want to rebel and start a rock band or something. According to a semi-official Castlevania timeline leaked by Konami, this game takes place in the year 1691. This is obvious in the character design, since you were dressed in some pretty amazing 17th century attire. Wouldn't Simon look awesome in a rock band? And you use short-range weapons like a whip, an axe, and a dagger. I mean, you're not running and gunning your way through Dracula's castle Bill and Lance style. I do realize that there were early forms of firearms available in Eastern Europe by the end of the 1600s, but A, they had inconveniently long reloading times that would have been impossible or annoying to replicate in a video game, and B, it's way more fun to throw a big spinning wooden boomerang through your enemies. The reason I'm mentioning the time period is because whenever there's a game, movie, TV show set in a specific time period, the music composer has to make a decision about whether or not to reflect that time period's music in the musical score. This can mean using musical scales or compositional techniques that were popular at the time of the game or movie's setting, or, in the case of film scores, using only instruments that existed during the time period of the movie's setting. Take the NES game The Legend of Cage, for instance. Ugh, I can't believe I'm using this game as an example for anything other than a poorly designed mess. According to the game's instruction booklet, the game takes place near the end of Japan's Edo period, which places the game somewhere around the year 1868. If you listen to the soundtrack to Legend of Cage, you might notice that it has a distinctly Japanese folk sound. This is because many of the tunes in the game are written using the notes of a Japanese musical scale called the In scale, also known as the Sakura scale. It's called the Sakura scale because this scale plays very prominently in the Japanese folk song Sakura Sakura, which any of you who have played Mike Tyson's Punch-Out should be familiar with. Sakura Sakura was a folk melody that became very popular in Japan during, hey, the Edo period! Wow, now that makes some sense. It's almost as if our Zuntata guys over at Taito actually knew what they were doing when they wrote the soundtrack. Amazing! But I digress. Let's get back to Castlevania. This game takes place, as you might expect, in Transylvania. This area, in what is today the country of Romania, was under Hungarian rule for roughly 300 years, from the mid-16th century until the mid-19th century. It wasn't recognized as an independent state from the Ottoman Empire until 1878. Because of this, the folk music of Romania is very closely associated with the folk music of Hungary, and there are a lot of similarities among different Eastern European countries' folk music. Now, a lot of what we know about these types of folk music is thanks to Zoltan Kodaly and Bela Bartok. These two men were composers and ethnomusicologists who visited Eastern Europe in the early 20th century and collected thousands of folk songs from numerous villages in the area. Kodaly collected folk music from Hungary, Romania, and Slovakia, whereas Bartok's collection was larger and more diverse. He studied the folk music of Hungary, Romania, Slovakia, and Bulgaria, as well as Moldavia and Wallachia, which used to be separate principalities like Transylvania, but later united to become modern-day Romania. So here are some of the common characteristics of the music of the time that our protagonist, Simon Belmont, might have been familiar with, and may have even demonstrated had he not gone into the vampire killing trade and followed his dream to be a rock star. 1. A lot of the music was fast. It was often intended for dancing at social events, and since the power ballad hadn't been invented yet, there really wasn't such a thing as slow dancing. 2. The structure of the songs was often very simple and square. Songs usually consisted of 4 lines of music of equal length, the second of which would often have the melody played a perfect fifth lower. For those of you who don't know what a fifth is in music, no, it's not a fifth of Beethoven, but a reference to the distance between 2 notes, which is called an interval. If you think of the A minor scale, which contains the 7 notes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G, you'll see that the notes A and E are 5 letters apart, representing a fifth. So if a Romanian folk song were to have a melody starting on the note E, the second time through the melody it would begin a fifth lower, on the note A. Okay, now for musical characteristic number 3. Romanian folk songs were built on a special type of pentatonic scale, meaning it contains 5 notes instead of Western music's usual 7, which is called a diatonic scale. This scale omitted the 2nd and 6th scale degrees. Looking at A minor again, this would mean that only the notes A, C, D, E, and G would be used. The notes B and F could still be used, but only in passing and not on strong beats. Here's what that scale sounds like. Now, does any of the music in Castlevania fit this description? Well, except for number 1, no, not really. Structurally, the arrangements in this game do not divide into 4 equally spaced sections. They're often slightly more complex than that, although the sections do generally have 4 or 8 measure phrases, but then again, so does jazz, rock, and pop music. There are no melodies in this game that are repeated a fifth lower either, so that pretty much eliminates number 2. And as for number 3, there's virtually no use of a pentatonic scale anywhere in this game. All of the tunes use fairly complex arrays of notes, and often contain even more than the standard 7 notes of the diatonic scale. In Western music there can be up to 12 distinct notes within an octave, which is an interval from one note letter name to that same note letter name above or below it on the keyboard. In fact, the complex music of this game sometimes resembles the music of the Baroque period. Let's get into that right now! Western music is often divided into style periods for point of reference. There are periods like the Classical period, which span from around 1750 to 1820, and contain composers like Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart and Joseph Haydn. The Romantic period ran from around 1820 to 1910-ish. The start and end dates of these periods are kind of nebulous and, if you ask me, a bit unnecessary, and showcase composers like Ludwig van Beethoven and Richard Wagner. The Baroque period started near the beginning of the 17th century and ran up until 1750. Now, you might like to call any music that was written between 1600 and 1900 classical music, but don't. Just don't. One of the most central figures to the Baroque musical period was this composer guy. Hold on, let me see if I can get this name correct. Johann Sebastian Bach? I don't know, he's apparently really famous for some reason, because he was a fucking genius that I don't really understand. The guy is practically synonymous with Baroque music, and he wrote works in practically every style that ever existed, and he wrote them all very well. He wrote for multiple instruments, and you'd be hard-pressed to name an instrument today that doesn't have some J.S. Bach works as part of its standard repertoire, 300 years later. His style has had far-reaching effects, and his influence is still seen in music today. I don't want to go on for 20 minutes telling you all how great Bach is, although I could, so let's just take a look at some of Bach's keyboard works. The man was an absolute genius at the organ and the harpsichord. He refined and perfected the art of counterpoint, which has to do with 2 lines of music that move independently of each other instead of with each other. The fugue is a special type of composition that uses counterpoint, but in a very strict and complex way, under very meticulous rules. It's considered by most music scholars to be one of the most sophisticated musical forms, and undoubtedly one of the most difficult to write. Bach wrote a series of 14 of these, basically just to rub it in that he could do it, and to showcase his mastery of the art of fugue, in a collection he called The Art of Fugue. Just why am I talking about all of this? You know, I often ask myself that same question these days. The point is, Bach's use of counterpoint is complex, it's cerebral, and it gives his pieces an exhilarating sense of forward motion. Take a listen to this piece by him. Now check this out. The two are definitely similar. There are a lot of surprising, complex, and delightful moments throughout the Castlevania soundtrack that mirror the adrenaline of Bach. Here's another example that might be a little easier to hear. However, this isn't to say that the soundtrack is purely Baroque. There are other options as well. Just because this game is set in 1691 doesn't mean that the composers have to write purely 17th century music. And this is where the magic of the game's soundtrack becomes apparent. There are clearly moments of the soundtrack that sound very much like modern music. There are hints of blues music, rock music, Jaws, and a pretty strong influence of heavy metal music. Some of this stuff practically sounds like 80s metal. It shouldn't be surprising that we hear such an influence of rock and metal music, coming from a company that had its own rock band. The elements of Baroque and heavy metal music combine to create a truly distinctive soundtrack in the NES library. You could even argue that the music has a neoclassical metal feel to it, comparing it to artists like Deep Purple and Yngwie Malmsteen. But no matter what you compare it to, what's obvious is that this game has some very special music that has captured our hearts and stuck with us after all these years. Konami broke new ground in the field of video game music, pushing the NES sound chip to its limits and even beyond them. Thank you, Konami Sound Team, for this gem of a soundtrack. And thank all of you for watching. Have a happy Halloween, everyone!